So we were using Paper.js to do the stuff on the canvas that was useful, like having images that moved around and click events and so on. But the trouble with Paper.js is that its error message is completely unhelpful. Even simple stuff like syntax errors, it wouldn't tell you where the syntax error was and so on. So this is an alternative. We're not going to use PaperScript at all. As you can see, I've just got vanilla JavaScript going on. And I'm going to try and do some of the same. I've done some of the same things. I've had to do a few workarounds and so on, and just taking you through what's different. So, firstly, we need to talk about the canvas within the document here, and the way we refer to the canvas when we're writing on it and so on is we use this thing called the context. You don't really need to know what's going on so much. You just copy and paste this line every time you want to talk about the canvas, and then you use the context to draw on. A little bit of a fishhook was that the canvas object, which is, if I just scroll down, this thing here, that doesn't load straight away, of course. What happens is the browser, as it loads stuff, as it loads JavaScript, it runs it straight away. So if you try and do get element by ID of my canvas immediately, it will not have loaded and it will fail, and you won't know why. So what I've done is I've put this line inside the window.onload, which is a function that fires when the entire window has loaded. So it waits until all the HTML is loaded, everything, and then it runs this function here. What I needed to do, of course, I needed to access the context elsewhere in the program, so I needed to make it a global variable, and also other stuff that I set up in this onload, sort of an initialization stage, I've made them globals as well. So the game is a global object, the sheep are global, and I've made that timer a global thing as well, so they're available everywhere. Next thing was Paper.js had a nice little kind of game loop thing going on. I can't remember what it was called, but we emulate that by having this, which every 50 milliseconds runs a function which I tell it which function to run. And if I again scroll down to the bottom here, this is my main loop, which has got exactly the same stuff in it that I had before. So every 50 milliseconds, that's 20 times a second. If you want creamy smooth 60 frames per second, you need to make that number a bit smaller. All straightforward so far. Next is putting an image onto the canvas. So the context, remember that context thing, drawing an image, blah blah blah. You'll see there's a slight, this is the whole thing to actually draw that image. You can see there's a slight complication involved. The problem is that if you try and just draw an image and you give it an image to draw, it tries to draw that immediately before it actually loads the thing. Even if this line was above here, it still wouldn't work because it takes time to go and get this image from the file system and so on. So what you have to do is you have to put it inside a callback. So this waits for that image to load and then it draws the image. Right? You don't really need to know too much about that, apart from you just copy and paste these lines whenever you need to draw an image on the canvas. Except I had this particular issue down here. I've got my move sheep object function down here method, and I needed to move the sheep. I'm changing this X position. I add 5 pixels to its X position, and then draw at the new position. If I try to do that here, obviously I've got this dot x position plus equals 5, and you'll notice here it's self dot. Well, it turns out that within the callback function, if you're using this, it doesn't necessarily refer to this that it thinks it's referring to. So it's very context sensitive. So this function will be firing after it's moved on. So the workaround that I got off the internet is to set a local variable which refers to this, and when it gets down to here, it uses that local variable. So basically, if you need to do something like this within with a this dot variable and a callback, then you need to do what I've done here. It shouldn't be a big deal. It might not even come up very much for you. Yeah, that's enough of drawing images. That works. you'll notice that this whole game object, game class here, where we make a game object, none of this has actually changed at all, although I might have just tidied it up in the way that I set as a task in class. Because I'd encapsulated it reasonably well before, I haven't had to tweak any of it. So there was no stuff that was fiddling around with the GUI or doing anything else. It was just to do with controlling the game. And that's one of the goals of doing good object-oriented programming, is you kind of remove all the hooks into other code, so everything can be worked on independently. Right, we're into this button click thing. So this was a bit of a problem. In Paper.js, there was some nice functionality for having an on-click function on a button, which we used, and also for drawing text onto a canvas. Now, you can do each of those things using vanilla JavaScript, works just fine, but it's quite complex, relatively speaking. So my workaround here to try and keep life simple is I've actually done it in the HTML. So I've got an image, which is a button, which has got a click event associated with it, and when that button is clicked, it does these things, which is exactly the same as we had before in the on-click event for the button image that was on the canvas. And similarly, in terms of drawing the text on the screen to show the timer being updated, you can draw text on the screen, but it's a bit awkward. So instead, I've made a little div, and I refer to my div, and I set the timer within that. Now, of course, that means that you don't quite get the control over it. You can't put these things onto the div, for instance, onto the canvas, I should say. So it means, yeah, you can't have the same control over the layout that you did before. But it's a lot easier, so let's just do the easy thing, shall we? And I think that is it. So if I just fire it up and everything works the same, click my button, sheep goes for run, click. I should point out one thing. You see the animation here. My sheep icon, luckily, was it's got a big white border around it. It's more than 5 pixels wide, because when we redraw the image, it doesn't erase what's there already in terms of what's on the canvas. Now there is a way to control the image, so you're actually moving that image, but it's quite fiddly again. So what I've done is I've just made it move only 5 pixels at a time, and the big white border overwrites everything that was there before, and I think that's not a bad little workaround, really. But yeah, be conscious of that when you come to do your own. Hopefully, and it's still in that little loop. Never fix that. Okay, hope that's helpful.